Meister Eckhart is one of the most fascinating minds in the Western tradition, and a mind, I suppose, that had its great flowering at the beginning of the millennium. Meister Eckhart was born around 1260 in a village called Hochheim near Erfurt in Germany. He became a novice at the Dominican house in Erfurt around 1277. In the 1270s he studied arts in Paris, and then he would have also done a lot of study in Köln, in Cologne, and there he studied under the famous Albert the Great, who had taught Thomas Aquinas. From 1293 to 94 he was lecturer in Paris on the sentences of Peter Lombard. 1294 he was prior of the Dominican house in Erfurt and vicar of the Dominican house in Thuringia. Then in 1302 he was called to the chair of theology in Paris, which was a recognition in his time and among his peers that he was a most brilliant man. 1303 to 1311 he was the provincial of the new province of the Dominican order in Germany, and he was reforming that whole province. 1311 he went to Paris as professor of theology, and then he was also very active in spiritual direction later around Germany. 1325 to 26, the first censure of his teachings actually happened, and in 1326 then he made his first defence. 1327 he appeals to the Pope alleging delays in his trial, and he went into the pulpit in Cologne in February 1327 to defend himself, and that was the time of the papacy in Avignon, so he went to Avignon then to defend himself as well. And actually at that time a man who would have had no sympathy with him was also defending his teachings, William of Ockham. In April then 1328 Eckhart died, and after he died then the papal document in Agro Dominico, which condemned him as a heretic, was actually published. So that's a brief outline of his life, and it spans a whole threshold and a whole era. What's remarkable about him is the kind of balance in his life between the most intricate and profound intellectual work, and which is evidenced in his Latin sermons particularly, and also a very fluent and very caring and very involved pastoral approach. He preached all over the place, he travelled widely, and travel was very difficult at the time. So that's a general background to his life. He also came, we'll say, after the great flowering of Greek philosophy, and particularly Neoplatonist philosophy. Thomas Aquinas would have preceded him, so he was in a way the inheritor of a very refined, complex and fascinating philosophical and theological system. And what's fascinating about him then is the turn that he actually put on it.
Can you set him in the context of, we'll say, the 13th century? You mentioned also the Pope's being at Avignon, so there was a certain amount of turbulence going on there, I suppose.
There was a certain amount of turbulence going on, and I suppose if you look at the history of thought and art, it's usually out of restless times and times of turbulence that great novelty and great light emerges in thought. And every great thinker is haunted by one idea or by one major obsession. And the delight and danger of Eckhart's mind is that his one obsession was the idea of God. And that's, I suppose, where there was most fire in his thinking. It was the informing idea for all of his work, and it was also the idea that brought him into trouble with the authorities at the time. And I suppose to say it succinctly and clearly, Eckhart's idea of God is that there's nothing closer to us than God. And that's where the church was very suspicious of him, maybe that he brought God too much down to earth, if you like. But in actual fact, if you go carefully through his thought, you see that the other polarity is within it as well, that the incredible distance of God is also there in him. He is fascinating for our times too, in that we live in times where there's an unprecedented spiritual hunger, I would argue. And so there is again the retrieval of a lot of ancient sources which have great nourishment and light in them, and Eckhart is definitely one of those. The fascinating thing about him is that he believed that the identity of the human person was really very, very intimately connected with our ability to think. So the thought, if you like, wasn't just a lens through which we see things, but thought was our very existence and presence. And he considered that God was really present in our thinking. So that when you thought of God, you weren't so much thinking about God or about a distant object, but you were awakening in some way the divine presence within you. And that's an experience that's fascinating in reading his work, is that when you read Eckhart and when you immerse yourself in his work and when you allow your consciousness to be schooled in the cloister of his thinking, what begins to happen to you is that his thought, rather than being a target of your own understanding or perception, begins to take the form of an icon which begins to look back at you. So the more you gaze at Eckhart's thinking and ideas, the more you feel that it actually begins to read you. And anybody who's ever got involved with Eckhart, his thought has really influenced their mind. One of the reasons for this is that he tries to think from within the divine mind. So his thought is a participation, if you like, in God's presence. And the God that Eckhart believes in is an incredibly wild kind of God. For instance, Eckhart believed, like, that we'll say everything had its origin in the mind of God. Like. And this is an old Neoplatonist idea, and it goes back to Plato himself indeed, that the origin of things is one of the most fascinating aspects of anything. In every culture, there are basic questions like the what question, which is what is a thing made of. The how question is the process of thing. The when question, like when does a thing happen, so that's the temporal dimension of it. And the who question, of course, is a really luminous question about who the identity of a person is and that what the identity is. But one of the most fascinating questions of all is the question of origin. Where do things actually come from? The German phrase is beautiful, woher. Where does it come out of? And the German word Ursprung is the word for origin. And springen is the German word for a thing that leaps or jumps out. And ur is the word for primal. So even in the word Ursprung, you have the idea of the primal place or well out of which everything sprung. And for Eckhart, that place is God. So that when you look around and you see people, human faces, you see events, you see landscapes, oceans, waves breaking, stars, birds, stones, flowers, none of these are here by accident, but each of them were actually born within the mind of God. He says somewhere beautifully in one of the Latin sermons that in the first glance of God, everything that is in the world was already kind of born. So you have that beautiful, what I'd call a very artistic notion of the divine imagination. An awful lot of theology and spirituality goes badly to ground in an excessive concentration on the will of God, and poor humans trying to beat their lovely, complex lives into the direction of that will, whereas Meister Eckhart tries to awaken you to the divine imagination and to help you realize that that's where you've come from, that's what holds you together in the world, and that's where your ultimate destination is. Wild is something that you can't tame. And I suppose that's one of the things that all institutional religion tries to do, is to have a few official tamers always on hand in case the divine thing wakens up in too wild a way. And the beauty of mysticism is that the mystic is someone who falls in love with God and who has a sense of the pulsing presence of God, which no thought, feeling, or category can ever come near. And so they keep the God presence and the God question clean of all our inferior and unworthy kind of answers. Like Eckhart, you hear people, Eckhart is wilder, to my mind, in his thinking about God than even the best atheist. Like, I've read Feuerbach, And, well, I wouldn't call Nietzsche an atheist, but he's very going in that direction, and Freud. And yet what you find in Eckhart about the wilderness and absence of God and in God is so much more profound than the kind of vacancy that you find around the atheistic idea. He says one place that God is that wilderness in which everyone is alone. The reason for that, and the way that he presents God in that way, is that he says that God is only our word for it, and that the nearer you get to the presence, the more God ceases to be God and is allowed to become completely himself. So the spiritual life then really is about the liberation of God from our images of God. Because an awful lot of people get totally hooked on a certain image of God, and that's where they stay all the time. And they can get hooked in a very negative image of God, like God as a judge or somebody that's watching you, a parental kind of super figure that keeps your life crippled. Whereas Eckhart's idea is that God isn't like that at all. God is the ultimate welcome and the ultimate hospitality to everything that is alive within you. And that if you really live your life to the full, then you are activating and making alive the presence of God within you. And the Eckhart has also this fascinating idea of the nothingness of everything. He talks about that all of creation stands under the umbra nihili, the shadow of nothingness. So that there is this lonely edge to our lives, this lonely edge to our minds, which can be filled by nothing else. And it's lovely the way that he develops the sisterhood of God and emptiness together. And in his wonderful teachings on detachment, he continually says that in order to come into the presence of God, you must free yourself from the grip of all external things, and you must let things go and be completely detached. He talks about prayer as well, and say that no prayer is more powerful than the prayer of the free mind. So one of the duties that humans have is to try to unclutter their lives of all the false things which pretend to satisfy and still their spiritual hunger, but can never actually do it. And he would see, I think, our human destiny here as, on the one hand, awakening the presence of God within us, but also freeing ourselves from everything that is not God. He's very radical in that regard. And he sees the soul as the place in which God is alive within us. Now, this is very relevant to today's world, because in contemporary American thought, for instance, soul is making a great comeback, like Thomas More's book, To Care for the Soul, and there's a whole series of different things coming out of that in America at the moment. And our souls are the places where we are divine. Like we used to always be taught, at least we were taught in school, that the soul was in the body inside somewhere, and when the body died, then the soul kind of did a runner. But in actual fact, Eckhart comes at it the other way and sees the body as being in the soul. So the soul present both suffuses you and it's all around you as well. And there is a place in the soul that no darkness or shadow or tears or separation or suffering or negativity can ever touch. That's what he calls the uncreated place within you. So that if you want to bring God alive within you, it's to that place that you must begin to journey. So he talks then about the birth of God in the soul. And he says wonderfully clear things like the incarnation of God in Jesus makes no difference at all to anyone if each person doesn't allow that birthing to happen within themselves. And he sees the potential of every person as being the ability to bring God to birth within them. It's a lovely thing actually in an age which is very conscious of gender, that it's not just a feminine prerogative to give birth, but both men and women can give birth to the divine within themselves. The lovely other aspect of it is that you don't need to go anywhere other than where you are to actually awaken to the divine presence. You know, so many people reach outside themselves for God, to institutions, to pilgrimages, to statues that tend to wiggle, and to different other kinds of externalist devices. Whereas Eckhart says all of this externality is governed by the world of image. The image place is a famine field. Whereas if you want the real nourishment, you must withdraw and come into the temple of your own soul, and there you will awaken what is really eternal within you. He talks about coming home to your soul, to the house that you never left, and where you have always been. I often think that the spiritual and mystical journey is about the conversion of a small little splinter of our minds. I think most of our mind knows that we're eternal, but there's one small little splinter somewhere which is haunted by distance and exile, and it's about bringing that splinter home so that we can be one in God again. Like, the fascinating thing about God is, once you get involved with the old God presence, and taste the divine, there's nothing else that'll ever satisfy you again.
But how difficult is that journey home? How difficult is it to find that uncreated part or place in the soul?
Well, this, of course, is the reason that we'd be talking about Master Eckhart as a Millennium Mind, or why, if you go in now to any worthwhile bookshop, that you have one wall full of do-it-yourself spiritual and psychological guides. And the reason for that is that we live in an interim time where the old religions are dying, and are losing credibility all the time. On the other side, there's a massive spiritual hunger, but the new form of spirituality hasn't actually emerged yet, so that there's a lot of people giving a lot of different options in an interim period, which are very banal and very false. Secondly, I'd say that there's awful pressure on psychology at the moment to become a kind of ersatz or substitute religion. And that's not what it's meant to do. I think that in the inner world, psychology can be good at unnetting when you're netted up and when you need to be freed and unraveled a bit. But I think for your eternal and divine nature, that the best guides to that inner world are the mystics. And Meister Eckhart is one of the best of the whole lot of them. Now, coming back home to the place in the soul where you're completely in rhythm with yourself and with everyone else and with God is a very difficult journey in a way. And yet, if you get hooked on the idea of the journey, its stages and everything, then you'll never get home. But the journey will become the kind of goal in itself. And Meister Eckhart is very radical here in that he says there is no such thing as a spiritual journey. His idea, it would seem to me, would be that anyone can come into rhythm with themselves. It's more a question of rhythm rather than traversing a long landscape towards a divine on some pinnacle. And I think there could be a beautiful mysticism written about the idea of rhythm, that when you're in rhythm with yourself, then in a way you're untouchable, because you're completely balanced and poised, and you can take any fall or anything can come towards you and it won't put you out of sync or out of step. So the things that he would recommend would be about a recovery of our ancient belonging and our ancient rhythm. And one of the key points here would be the idea of awakening or recognition. And I think that in most people's lives, that the moment of illumination or recognition is one of the most powerful moments that brings them back in home again out of the old winter of exile where their mind would have been foraging for nourishment in the famine fields of image. So his mysticism is a very intellectual mysticism in that it believes in the power of thought as a great light and also a power that can open the doorway to your own heart.
Do many people, or do most people maybe, remain in those, what you call those famine fields of image?
Well, I think that we all move between different places there. I think that there's no one in the world who would be able to sustain total, pure, absolute divine presence all the time, because you wouldn't be able for it. Like the Bible says, no one can see God and live. So what happens is that you're in and out of there, but if you're not anchored in your own inner world, and if you don't belong to yourself in that ancient way, then you can really get totally lost. And that's the need, I suppose, for some direction for people, and why we need guides like him who will show you where you're getting lost and will also hint to you where the homeland actually lies. I suppose psychology would never satisfy me as a way of accounting for the mind. And I love the imagination. And I also love thought. I think thought is an incredible presence. It's what makes the world intimate and takes the anonymity out of it. And I think in the engagement with Meister Eckhart, one's thought becomes so refined, and a lot of the dross that blinds your thinking becomes cleaned off. He said a lovely sentence that you could write a whole psychology about. He said, thoughts are our inner senses. And if you think of our outer senses, like if your eyes are impaired or your hearing's impaired, then you don't see things or you don't hear things. Like poor Beethoven, I was listening to the program on him, about the way his hearing began to go and he couldn't even play at the end. And if you take the same analogy inwardly, if thoughts are your inner senses, then if your thoughts are weak, if they're negative or if they're impoverished, you'll never see anything in yourself. So one of the great duties of every human is to actually develop their own thoughts that are adequate to them and worthy of the possibilities that sleep in their souls. One of the greatest tragedies of our times is that everyone is ripping off second-hand thinking from other people, which is dead and doesn't fit them at all. So one of the things about liberating oneself, I think, is to actually trust your own instinct and find the kind of thought lenses which show you your world in the way you need to see it, that can calm you and bring you home, and also challenge you where you're limited or deficient or where you don't actually want to see.
You would argue that he's becoming more and more relevant for the world we're living in now at the end of this millennium.
I absolutely would, because I think that there is great muscle to his thinking, there's great complexity in it, and there's great depth as well. And I think his distrust of the world of image is utterly relevant and profound. Like, everyone's going on about the internet, I was talking to Lelia Doolan about it one time, and Lelia said, like, the fact that people have all this technological communicative ability doesn't mean that good work will actually be done. And I see the internet, it's a great facility, but I see it a bit like Plato's allegory of the cave, like, that it's the images on the wall of the cave. All it is images, like. And it's questionable whether such abstract images ever really bring the complexity and depth of people to real encounter or to real intimacy. I also think that the PR world, which is ancient sophistry, like, which Socrates fought against about making the weak argument look strong, that's what PR is about. And I think in this world, in our modern world, where we've created an image world, if you like, that some person like him, who has such fire and such clarity and such depth in his thought, really breaks through that false wall. I also think that our age is very functional, that there are goals and purposes set up and programs for everything. And the lovely thing about Meister Eckhart is that he had an absolute suspicion of the program, and hated programs because he saw that they actually brought people, they hooked people. The program hooked the person, and you never got where you intended to get through the program. The program became an end in itself. And our world today is haunted and obsessed with functional thinking, which sees everything in terms of a process. Like in America, you'll hear people describing their own souls as if they're describing a machine. Like, it's awful. And the lovely thing about Eckhart is he keeps God and the mystical way totally free of that. He says beautifully that God is God and is without a why. Non habet quare, sed ipsum est quare omnimum et omnibus, that God has no why, but yet he is the why of everything and to everything. A follower of Eckhart later on was Angelus Silesius, who wrote a beautiful little short mystical poem called Without Why, Ona Varum. The rose is without why. She blooms because she blooms. She does not care for herself, asks not if she's seen. That, to me, is one of the beautiful things in Eckhart, is the idea of letting things be. He says again somewhere, like so many people wonder what they should do, where they should go, how they should work. He said none of this really matters. The most important question to always keep focused on is how you should actually be. And if you look at that, that's really mindfulness of presence. And presence is the most radical thing in the world. And all intimacy, love, belonging, and real creativity is not when the grubby little mediocre hands of our functional minds get into the mystery, but it's actually when we stand back and let the mystery be and become somehow enveloped in it, and it extends us and deepens us. The third thing I'd say in relation to that is that Meister Eckhart, from that teaching, has a lovely idea of Gelassen. Gelassen in German is the word for calmness. And he has a lovely idea of Gelassenheit, of calmness and mental equilibrium. And even when things are going against you, and when things are complex, and the old rhythm is very, very dangerous in your life and taking you to places, awkward, lonely places, that you can still maintain a stillness which is in your soul. You don't have to grab it, but you can allow the deeper stillness that is within you to actually connect you and to give you a lovely, inviolable belonging and togetherness. And that's not something you can achieve with a program, but it's something that you can actually awaken within your own heart.